have one last presentation for today, entitled War and Peace from the Perspective of Feminist Anti-War Resistance. Danijela Lugarić Vukas is a literary scholar and a cultural historian who holds a PhD from the University of Zagreb, where she works as an associate professor. She has undergone professional training at the Faculty of Philology, and the University of California, Berkeley. She was visiting professor at the Department of Russian Language and Literature at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Mostar in Bosnia. She has written numerous papers and monographs in the fields of literary and cultural studies in Soviet and Yugoslav post-socialism, memory studies, trauma studies, femininity and gender history. She edited volumes for several publishers. Apart from researching contemporary Russian and Russophone novels from the 2010s, she recently also translated Oksana Vasyakina's novel Wound. Thank you.
Thank you for this kind introduction. And I have to say that after Tomáš's brilliant presentation, I have the feeling that now we will go a step back, because his presentation actually gave the answers to some of the questions that I will pose, and I will finish my presentation with questions. This presentation actually is in a dialogue, quite curiously, with Yuri's presentation that we heard a little bit before. It has some conceptual similarities also on the level that we both speak about our own experience, but also on the level that we actually indirectly or directly pose the same question, and that is, what is the force, if there is any force, to advocate for peace in Ukraine and Russia? Also I have to make one small disclaimer. There is this notion of hermeneutic circle, as you well known. So basically it means that our understanding of something is based on understanding the pieces, and then the pieces gives the meaning to the whole. And from literary studies, and this is my primary occupation, we know that the end always sometimes puts another light on the whole piece of art, of the whole literary work. So we didn't reach the end of Russian war in Ukraine, and therefore I won't have many reflections, because it needs to end. So when I first received a kind invitation to participate in this conference, only one war occupied my mind thoroughly, and it was the Russian war in Ukraine. And as a Russian scholar who in the past decades spent weeks and weeks and months in Russia, in its libraries and its universities and occasionally archives. I lived and I lived through that war very intensively. I have witnessed a number of my Russian colleagues being displaced all over the world. So the whole community I once had in Russia is now spread around the world. Majority of them are in precarious positions as scholars, and many of them are in Israel, if I might add. I was insecure on how to teach and write about Russian literature. For many months, I was literally obsessed by rereading thousands of pages of Tolstoy's War and Peace, trying to find some answers there to help me understand better what is going on. At Zagreb University, I teach, among other courses, a course on Kievan Rus, and I became very insecure on how to present that period to students and how to connect it with the present-day Russia. Croatian Ministry of Science and Education launched their recommendation to abstain, this is the word I'm quoting, from cooperation with Russian scholars and institutions, and together with my colleagues, we have tried to find ways to continue working with them under these new circumstances, along with deciding for ourselves whether we want to continue cooperating or not, because many of my colleagues simply decided that they would not continue their research in Russian studies, and they focused instead on learning Ukrainian and very passionately turned to decolonizing the field and, if I may add, self-colonizing themselves. Since I have translated and published in various well-read media in Croatia different anti-war texts written by Russian authors and thinkers, I cannot be sure that I would be able to obtain a visa to go to Russia ever again, even if I would feel safe enough to go there at the moment. At the same time, I strongly oppose to canceling Russian culture. Therefore, I've wrote and published again in popular and more or less widely read journals reviews of every literary work published in the last couple of years in Croatian translation. In the meantime, meaning since I received this invitation, the new war began, or it continued in a more open and publicly recognized manner, and these two wars overlapped in my head and my heart. Nevertheless, I will try to conceptualize using resources gathered during the last year and 9 months by the feminist anti-war resistant movement, which originates from Russia and was established a couple of days after the war began, what prevents us to think about peace in these situations. The key argument is very plain and very simple. Every conflict, discursively speaking, permits and accumulates its strength on intensive and prolonged processes of humanization and dehumanization, of capturing the ways other people are different from us. Just to recall, othering includes describing the people who we keep distant from us because we decide they're not like us. By demonstrating how the media strips of humanity one side in a conflict, preventing and controlling even the possibility of seeing two lives, Ukrainian and Russian, Palestinian and Israeli, in their equivalent fragility, I propose, following Butler, and she was heavily criticized in the last months, I know it, but still I will use her theoretical framework, that seeing two lives in their equivalent fragility is essential in restoring peace as a more humane reaction to the human condition of injury and or vulnerability. But first, let me share my own experience of participating in Croatia's one and only anti-war demonstration, which I assisted in organizing with a handful of my female friends and colleagues on February 24th, 2023. The whole idea resonates from women in black peace activism that traditionally organized anti-war campaigns in Israel and former Yugoslavia and have relied on undermining militarist national sovereignty. So this is just one quotation from the manifest that we distributed. Negotiations do not mean surrendering, and amassing arms does not ensure victory. As peacekeepers and feminists, we particularly support related peace initiatives and efforts in Ukraine, Russia, and around the world. We know that peace entails much more than simply ending war. Peace is a long-term process in which women are the primary agents of social healing and normalization of life, as well as care for the most vulnerable social groups. And here is the link to the petition that we posted online, and it was signed by 68 people. One of the organizers, and she is a journalist in Jutarnji List, announced the text and a call at her webpage, and it was followed by a huge number of very violent reactions, such as, I didn't translate it in English, and I apologize, I assume somehow that all people here will at least speak some of the Serbian, Croatian, or Slovenian. So I do apologize. Kandidiram ovu inicijativu za godišnju nagradu dr. Ante Pavelić 45. Putler Band Aid. Nekad ću samo tragično nerazumijevanje situacije u ovoj peticiji, jedna povijesna bedastoća, ovo je samo mahanje feminizam u svrhu samo promocije ili čega već. Ukrajina je sad žena koju upravo siluju, što je pošteno da zahtijevamo i od koga, mi ostale žene. Vjerojatno je namjerno išla eksploatirati feministički diskurs, a u isto vrijeme izbjegavati konkretne formulacije da bi dobila veći odjek i širu podršku, ni prva ni zadnja koja to radi. Autorice antiratne peticije bile su na briefingu u ruskom veleposlanstvu. Ponekad je bolje ne napraviti ništa nego raditi štetu u javnom prostoru, a peticija koju pokreću ugledne mirovnjakinje feministice s tekstom koji kao da je iz kremaljske radionice ispao, radi štetu u javnom prostoru. Na godišnjicu ruske agresije se organizirali skup podrške ruskim ciljevima, bravo vi, svatko tko nije organizirao ništa, učinio je društveno korisniju stvar od vas. Vaš poziv na pregovore, granata je spaljena na Ukrajince. Janković, that was one of the initiators of the protest, she was renamed Januković. Ovakvi pacifisti su u ovom trenutku profašisti, opravdavaju današnje Hitlere i prepuštaju mu da žrtvi radi što hoće, tako će ih povijest pamtiti. Pacifizam je kolaboracija s neprijateljem, potpisnice su korisne budale Putinu. And I read all of these reactions only, and I've put the photograph here, this photography here, just to show you the discrepancy between what we did. So there was only 20 of us, including my daughter. She was among these 20 people, 20 women, and the reactions that we received. So historical mistake, just to see, it's interesting, I think, to see the discrepancy that happened between what happened in reality and how people reacted on it. So in some ways the reactions were predictable and foreseeable if we consider the whole situation in the context of the polyphony that surrounds female and feminist responses to Russian war in Ukraine. There are three major streams to consider. Each of them represents a very different approach to resolving this ongoing conflict. The first one is Feminist Resistance Against War Manifesto, written on 17 March 2021, and it was written mostly by Spanish-speaking feminists from Spanish-speaking areas, Latin and South Americas. And I will not read everything because it's not necessary, only the part that is highlighted. We profoundly condemn the military invasion led by the Putin regime in Ukraine, which has already left thousands of people dead and hundreds of thousands displaced, and which provokes a sharpening of the confrontation between imperialistic blocs at the global level. They mention NATO as somebody being co-responsible. And then there is this another stream, which is quite interesting, especially in the context of Yuri's presentation that we heard today. This is the reaction from Ukrainian feminists, and it's called The Right to Resist, a Feminist Manifesto. Maybe I should do this. The Right to Resist, a Feminist Manifesto, written in July 2022, and also I will not read everything, just the end. We stand for the right to resist. If Ukrainian society lays down its arms, there will be no Ukrainian society. If Russia lays down its arms, the war will end. And this is the visuals that go with the manifest. As you can see, not the number, but still the people, the countries from which people who signed this manifest originate. And what is interesting also is that the Ukrainian feminists, they directly refer to the first manifest that I wrote. So they say the authors of the Feminist Resistance Against War Manifesto deny Ukrainian women, etc. So there is a conflict between first and second stream. And then the third one, which I followed the most, it's because of my interest in, of course, in Russian studies, is the one from Russian anti-war feminist resistance, which was formed after the war. And here it's quite an interesting story altogether, because they say, as Russian citizens and feminists, we condemn this war. Feminism as a political force cannot be on the side of war of aggression and military occupation. The feminist movement in Russia struggles for vulnerable groups and the development of a just society, etc. War means violence, poverty, and they organized very interesting different activities, political activities in Russia. And just the visuals are very interesting because they have this white dove with olive branch, which is a symbol of peace. Curiously enough, after 6 months of war, feminist activists from Russia updated their manifesto because there was a need to clarify, as they say, there is a need to clarify our positions on specific issues. In particular, we don't want to be confused with feminist resistance against war because they advocate for the disarmament of Ukraine. Russian feminist activists don't agree with that and are for arming Ukraine and basically for the continuation of war. So what we see here is that actually opposing the war, so anti-war in the title of their organization, doesn't imply asking for a peace. It simply means opposing to war, whatever that means. So it's basically, we have this very confusing epistemological situation where ending war doesn't mean restoring peace or advocating even for a peace. In an attempt to understand the shortcomings of feminist stance towards this war, why resisting war doesn't imply asking for a peace, and in general violent reactions to extremely small and significant Zagreb anti-war protest, I propose to take a quick look at Judith Butler's 2003 interview, Peace is Resistance to the Terrible Satisfaction of War, and an interview with Judith Butler. So I will also not read everything, just the main ideas that are important for me now here. What or who intervenes to stop a cycle of violence precisely the moment where one is tempted to strike back? What are the conditions under which we find that we are responsive to other human beings, being responsive, seeing or sensing suffering, responding to it? That is the main issue out of which an entirely, as she says, different politics would emerge. And then she asks a very interesting question, maybe interesting for us all here. Does war have anything to do with peace? I think the Bush government, she wrote this interview in 2003, she gave this interview in 2003, as conveyed in the words declaring the opening of the war, things that will have this war and that will lead to peace because we'll uproot the sources of evil in the world and then there will be no more. That is, of course, a false argument. War begets war. And she also says that war and peace are two different reactions one could have to the human condition of injury or vulnerability. How to break a cycle of revenge. To break a circle of revenge means to recognize and to appreciate the two lives in their equivalent fragility. And she restores to Emmanuel Levinas, peace as a vagueness to the precariousness of the other. So to recognize and appreciate the two lives in their equivalent fragility means to recognize who and what a human being is. We recognize others as humans to the extent that they conform to certain norms governing what appears as human to us. Humanism only takes some humans to be human and forgets whole population of others. I think maybe we have to ask more specifically about the notion of civilization. There are different ways of defining it, but it seems to be a framework within which we see human beings as human. There are lots of modes of knowledge that seems to think that human beings achieve their humaneness only they become civilized. So she basically connects very strongly, the question of who is a human with what is a civilization. So inability to recognize and appreciate the two lives in their equivalent fragility has to do with humanization and dehumanization. How do people become humanized? How do we come to understand them to be human beings rather than some distant entity we could never hope or desire to understand? So, just a second. So what I just want to show you, this is not visible well enough. I'm using now resources from the anti-war feminist movement from Russia. They have this very active page on Telegram, and here just the subjects that they have. So if I would be able now to click on this Telegram page, you would see that they have, for example, under hashtag Vaši akci, means your actions, or voices of Russian people, they have like literally thousands of different posts made in last year and a half. So there is a strong activity in Russia which we don't see and don't recognize because of this process of humanization and dehumanization that goes on in the media. And Tomasz talked about it very nicely and very powerfully before me. So I cannot show you all of them, of course, because it's impossible to go through all of them, but I will just show you what would mean, I guess, to humanize the enemy, to humanize Russian, if our media would be more sensitive to these cases. So these are some of the examples, and I'm not sure how well you see it. These are just screenshots, and these are just some of the people, some of the women that were prosecuted in the last month and a half. Not to mention what was before in Russia. The first one is an anti-war activist. She was transferred to a psychiatrist hospital because of her anti-war stand. Then the second one is Olga Nazarenko. She recently died after she was once a teacher. She got fired as a teacher from her job after she participated in 2 anti-war protests in support of political prisoners. The third one is a journalist. She is imprisoned because she refused to register herself as a foreign agent. And then there is Tomsk music teacher. She was fined 100,000 rubles, which means like 10,000 euros approximately, for discrediting the army. Then there is the second one is the quite famous example, Evgenia Berkovic. She's now imprisoned for many months. She's an artist, and she has 2 daughters, and they suffer from different problems because they are separated from their mother. Then there is one example that was actually quite present in our media at the beginning of war, and this is Marina Ovsyannikova. This is the woman who, during the news on Russian television, she held the sign "No War," and she was deprived of parental rights after anti-war protests. Her son, mother, and ex-husband testified against the woman in court. So this is a court in Kazan sentenced a popular Insta blogger and designer of Muslim clothing for women to 3 years in a penal colony in a case involving calls for military desertion. And this is one of the activities that is also organized by Russian feminists. They collect money. They were collecting money for Marina Novikova. Altogether, people collected 1 million rubles. And the another thing that is maybe quite interesting, this is a series of interviews that is currently held in Russia about why women from prison go to war. It is not an act of patriotism. It's written here in Russian, разговоров о патриотизме нет. So they don't go to war because of patriotism. They go to war to restore their parental rights. Then there is another one in the middle about how migrants are forced to go to war. They go to war in exchange for citizenship. And there is another thing on the right side. There is a whole podcast called Sisters about what awaited the loved ones of those who went to war and what soon awaits our entire society, Russian entire society, upon their return. There is then on the left side an article about military desertion. In the years since mobilization was announced, the number of desertions has almost quadrupled. In addition, there have been reports of mass desertions of military personnel from Wagner and Sturm. And then there are also, which is quite interesting to read, the testimonies of men after the announcements of mobilization. And the title of this, you cannot read it, but the title of this text is, I began to understand. This is the interview with a man who was mobilized, and he responded, I began to understand how women feel when they're threatened. And then on the right side, how Russians are suing over their mobilization and winning. And this is, and then the last one is about volunteers. So the Russian feminists, they collect volunteers of the people who escaped to Russia during the war. And then on the right side, there is, I also didn't know, there is a whole series of concerts in Russia, anti-war concerts that is organized throughout Russia, and these are some of the songs that they play. So I'm not making, I will not have any conclusion to this presentation. As I said at the beginning, my and Yuri's presentation is conceptually similar because we try to find an answer to the question who will advocate for peace in Russia or Ukraine. And for what attracted here my attention is what makes anti-war but not at the same time for peace stance a feminist one. What type of feminism that is, if it is against the war but not for peace. And perhaps if we would be allowed to hear and to see more faces and hear more voices from Russia, if we stop othering Russia and Russians, perhaps peace wouldn't be in this context a pejorative word anymore. And thank you for your kind attention.